Back live with you tonight on In Focus. Going back to one of our top stories tonight, the U.S. ambassador to South Africa has accused Pretoria of aiding Russia with arms. During a media briefing earlier, Reuben E. Brigety II said he believes ammunition was loaded on a Russian cargo ship that docked at Simonstown Naval Base in the Western Cape in December. The accusation brings into question a possible foreign policy crisis between Pretoria and Washington. But to help us unpack this assertion by Ambassador Brigety, we have Professor John Stremlau, as well as foreign policy analyst Peter Fabricius. Good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on tonight. Let me read once again what the ambassador says. The ambassador says, "We are confident that weapons were loaded onto the vessel. I would bet my life on the accuracy of the assertion. The arming of Russia by South Africa with the vessel that docked in Simonstown is fundamentally unacceptable." Prof, let's start here. What goes into a decision to sell arms to another country? And did South Africa, if indeed it is true that they've done this, as the president says it still will be investigated, apply itself properly in making that decision?
Well, Reuben Brigety makes the point repeatedly that sovereignty matters, and South Africa is a sovereign state, and it is free to decide what it's going to do with regard to buying or selling arms. However, there are consequences for any decision taken, and I'm really struck in light of the false intelligence that characterized the Iraq intervention back in 2003, where there were no weapons of mass destruction, and George Tenet said it was a slam dunk. This is a very different CIA. Bill Burns I've known for years, and he's extremely cautious and careful. And Reuben Brigety is also very cautious and very careful, former ambassador to the AU for Obama, and I know wants to see South Africa-U.S. relations improved, but he felt under instructions that he simply had to lay down a marker on this question of the Lady R. Now, Peter has reported on this in much greater detail than anything I would know.
Peter, does this particular transaction, if it did happen, have any kind of legal implications? I mean, we've got the National Conventional Arms Control Committee that looks at this particular issues of selling arms to any particular country. But do you think that the right channels were followed, the right structures were put in place to deal with this particular transaction? So more than a legal issue, we might be talking more a diplomatic and an internal political issue.
Yeah, I think on the legal level, there's no evidence that the National Conventional Arms Control Committee was consulted and asked for its approval, and so that would be a problem under our own law. But as you say, the wider issue here is the diplomatic one, because one of the things that Ambassador Brigety said today, he said, as John has mentioned, South Africa is a sovereign nation and has the right to pursue its own foreign policy, even if this is inconsistent, if it proved true with its non-aligned stance. But he also made the point, and I've heard that from congressional sources as well, that the U.S. also has a sovereign right to pursue its own national interest in foreign policy. And that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about South Africa being taken to the International Criminal Court or anything. We're talking about our relations with the U.S. And if the U.S. decides that we have acted in a way that's contrary to the national interest, then we may suffer consequences.
So I heard some South Africans also coming into the debate saying, well, I mean, we've been selling arms to NATO-aligned countries and non-NATO-aligned countries for years, and the U.S. also sells arms to all sorts of places. I mean, there are others who are saying the U.S. could even be involved with a paramilitary group in Sudan, giving them arms and so on and so forth. So they don't see what the big deal is if indeed South Africa sold arms to Russia. Peter?
I'd answer that at two levels. To me, morally, it would be really abominable to be selling arms to Russia when it's destroying, Ukraine lives and infrastructure with such an imbalance of force. in that war. I mean, you can make comparisons with others, but as I said earlier, what it really just comes down to is that for the U.S. and as well as many European countries, and them in particular because they're right there, this is a very critical national an issue of national security interest. They feel threatened, by what Russia's doing. So it would be we do have to understand just how seriously the U.S. takes this. Is what I'm really trying to say.
Yeah, it certainly does. I mean, the language from Brigety was quite strong, Prof. But is this, again, where we are seeing the geopolitical interests intersect with the economic considerations?
Well, wait a minute. You've got to look at this as a fundamental issue about balance of power in 19th century colonial push against a sovereign nation, a neighbor, and the breaking of the core norm, which Africans and South Africa in particular have been very strong in supporting, namely territorial integrity and sovereign equality. That's the basis for the UN. And that's the basis for building a peaceful integration process on the continent. Back in 2003, Thabo Mbeki and Nelson Mandela were very firm in protesting about the U.S. incursion into Iraq. And I don't think that they can have this double standard and not oppose the invasion of a sovereign neighbor, Ukraine, but they have, and so that's their prerogative, and we're now reaping the benefits of that, or the cost of it.
Yeah. The U.S., does it have a right to be moralistic about this?
Well, moralistic is I think it does, actually, but moralistic is something that the diplomats don't like to talk about because they talk about interests, but in fact there are norms here, there are values here, that we feel that a world is based on sovereign equality and territorial integrity, even if it's not honored always in all cases. And of course, the U.S. has had egregious past record, but they're right on this one, and so South Africa ought to applaud the West's standing up for a principle that has been at the bedrock of the African Union and the African Charter for Elections Governance and political affairs. And so let's get real on this.
Does this have implications for South Africa in terms of, one, the UN resolutions, but also will the members to the United Nations Security Council want to respond if indeed it is proven so? And would they be justified in doing so?
Well, the Security Council, as you know, has been rendered almost completely dysfunctional by this war. So all those resolutions against Russia have been taken in the General Assembly. I mean, certainly the two other members of the security, permanent members, will object, the Western ones, and of course Russia and China will not, and so on. So I'm not so sure about the global implications, but in terms of the UN. But what I do think we ought to be focusing on here is how is this serving South Africa's own interests? This is not just a question of kowtowing to US interests. It's a question of how does it how does it serve our interests? And I think as ordinary South Africans, we should be asking ourselves, how is it that the nostalgia that a lot of people in the ANC have for their old Soviet ties, the money perhaps that the ANC is getting from a Russian oligarch who's a friend of Putin's, and this deep-seated anti-Americanism, these are holding the rest of us ransom as far as I can see it. If we do, I mean, we do need to be pragmatic and ask ourselves, is it worth upholding our independence on those grounds, and possibly losing serious economic advantage as a result.
So, I mean, from where you're sitting, Peter, you're saying that it's probably more a political and diplomatic upside for the ANC in this arrangement alongside its BRIC partners more than it is in the economic interest of South Africa.
I do believe that, actually. I mean, I'm not saying with that BRICS is not a good thing. It can be a good thing, but we've just seen the other day, or even China and even China, along with the other BRIC partners, Brazil and India, voted for a resolution which, in passing, condemned Russia's aggression, while we abstained once again. So it is possible to state your position in objecting to this invasion without abandoning your BRICS non-alignment, actually.
Yeah. Prof, I mean, the economic relations that admittedly between South Africa and the BRICS nation remain quite a minute fraction, although we saw China taking away its grain budget from the U.S. and buying quite a huge consignment this time around from South Africa, more than what they normally do. But the conversation is that there is this realignment, geopolitical realignment, which would see China certainly becoming a much more profitable partner for South Africa. Could that have been a consideration?
Look, South Africa should do business with China. It should do business with the European Union, and they should do business with the United States. This is business, and the corporate, there's 600 companies from the United States operating down here, and there is an extensive trade relationship symbolized by the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is up for renewal in 2025. And I think that you can walk and chew gum at the same time, and there's no reason why you can't take principled stand as Mbeki and Mandela did with regard to the incursion into Iraq, and then at the same time develop a very, very important and useful PEPFAR program that George W. Bush championed and which is still working $100 billion for eliminating HIV and AIDS. So, it's not that it's either or, it's that you ought to be able to negotiate through these various complications a win-win. And I think that there's no danger of a Cold War emerging between China and the U.S. in Africa. It may happen in the South China Sea, but that's another part of the world. It's just that the South Africans don't have a dog in the fight of Ukraine and Russia, except that they do on the normative side of territorial integrity and sovereign equality, which is a bedrock of the African Union and the African Charter of Democracy, Elections and Governance.
South Africa's head of diplomacy says this in a tweet as a response. I suppose people trying to get reaction from him, saying there's been discussions between us and our U.S. colleagues on the subject, and an approach was agreed to. Megaphone diplomacy was not part of that. I suppose saying the United States here opted for an option that was not on the table. One, would that be indicating, I suppose, the growing irritation of the United States in South Africa's sitting on the fence?
Well, it's an interesting, and I have no inside information on this, but the timing, because Ambassador Brigety returned with Sidney Mufamadi from the effort to try to shore up cooperation between the United States and South Africa, and they must have gotten incredible intelligence on this Lady R shipment that goes back to December. The fact that he would then, Ambassador Brigety would go public with it at this particular moment, in light of the fact that he came back with Sidney Mufamadi, they must have discussed this at some point. And he just didn't have an alternative, and the U.S. government didn't think it had an alternative because they had the goods. And I think it's credible. I don't have any doubt that Brigety is telling what he firmly believes to be the case, and Peter's reporting seems to support it, actually.
Yeah. Peter, if we had to look at how foreign policy relations work, I mean, would the United States have to present South Africa with tangible evidence? What we're hearing from the presidency spokesperson, certainly up until now, and earlier on, one of the DSGs of the ANC also saying, well, we've seen this particular matter, but the United States has not presented us with any tangible evidence. Kind of sounds like what we saw during the Easter period, where they say there'll be an attack in Sandton, and then South Africa said, well, there's no evidence that has been given to us.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to make comparisons because, all these circumstances are very different. Look, I don't know about this agreement, which was the first time it had come to light. That was revealed by Vincent Magwenya, that there had been this understanding between the U.S. and South Africa that they would deal with this issue and appoint a judge and so on to investigate. But what we have to look at here is the context. This is 6 months or so after this very mysterious visit of the Lady R to Simonstown base, and people observing it in the dark, loading and unloading, and the Defence Force being constantly peppered with requests for information and not saying a word. So if the U.S. ambassador has decided to go public now, it's possible that it's out of frustration that this is not being dealt with. What if there's I don't know exactly what happened here. I mean, there was just this very mysterious activity by the ship in the middle of the night, like on 2 consecutive nights. But if if this was completely innocent, why didn't the Defense Department say so? They could have said so 6 months ago.
Yeah. Certainly, this will have local political implications, I suppose. You think the South African government is concerned about the local political fallout more than it is about the international fallout?
Are you asking me that?
Yes, Peter.
Yeah. Look, I mean, the domestic politics of this issue are very, very complex, as you would know. I mean, obviously, it's divided, on kind of on the same grounds as our politics more generally, with the DA very enthusiastically supporting Ukraine, and today John Steenhuisen was quizzing President Ramaphosa in Parliament about what, did we sell arms or not, and he wouldn't answer directly. So, and of course, I think it also plays probably to some degree into factional politics in the ANC, because, I mean, the pragmatists in the ANC, I'm sure, don't like this very much, but there are also ideologues who do, So it's, I can see to some degree why Ramaphosa treads on this, as he does on all issues, it seems to me, very, very delicately,
Peter Fabricius and Professor John Stremlau, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on tonight and being with us here on In Focus. Continue to take your thoughts, 072-110-5584, or tweet us tonight at Newzroom 405. What do you make of how South Africa is handling its economic diplomacy between the U.S. and, of course, the BRICS nations? In Focus continues shortly.